that has troubled you or troubles you currently. Let me give you some quick examples. DNA research on Book of Mormon people that seems to contradict the book's claims about its origins might be an example. I don't understand the church's position on homosexuality in today's world. How can God be behind the choice of my bishop, who is not ethical in a business dealing with me? I hate everything about polygamy. So you might make a note. What's one of those issues been for you? And I'm not trying to suggest that we don't have every right to take a hard look at the science of DNA research, or the holes in our understanding of homosexuality, or the nature of revelation about church callings, or the history of polygamy, but I am suggesting that we may have an easier time exploring these issues logically, helpfully, and creatively if we have a reasonably clear understanding of how the issue affects us personally, how it taps into our historical injuries or betrayals, and thus how our vision may be blurred about that subject. As an example, let's take polygamy, often a loaded issue for people, but one I've learned as a psychologist is loaded very differently for different folks. When I ask Pat what stands out for her as a problem with polygamy, her attention goes primarily to Joseph Smith apparently having lied to his wife and others about his polygamous relationships. For someone else, the bigger problem may be Joseph Smith's involvement with young women, or the potential for abuses of power, or the possibility of having to live polygamy again. But for now, let's consider how Pat might answer these questions. What is the question? We'll look at polygamy. For her, it was specifically about his lying to his wife. What's the personal problem this issue exemplifies or creates for me? If my husband were doing this, I'd feel betrayed. This exemplifies the way men cheat on their wives and justify it any way they can. When have I faced a similar problem? My father cheated on my mother and lied about it for years. I felt betrayed and like men could not be trusted when I learned about it. If the church is true, what does this issue make you wonder about God? Makes me wonder if God can be trusted either. I can't tolerate a God like that. I'm not sure I can stay in a church that makes me think God would allow a prophet to lie to his wife. If I accept the church's viewpoint, what might it mean about me? It might mean I'm one of those women who let men walk all over them and are so dependent on them they will tolerate deceit and lies. So we begin to see how Pat's background and history affects the options that she can see, the options that she can legitimize, the options that she can tolerate. This issue was one that Pat began to explore and look at in her own history, realizing that her history with a promiscuous parent colored somewhat how she viewed Joseph Smith and in turn how she viewed God. After some thought about this, she writes, I realized as I approached the topic of polygamy that I have a real sensitivity to the issue of men lying to their wives about sexuality. This issue has impacted me personally and deeply. I have a hard time imagining that Joseph Smith could have had any other motivation than self-indulgence and self-protection in his handling of polygamy. But I can also see that someone without my background might not jump so quickly to that conclusion and might be freer to see different meaning in his behavior. I once had a strong testimony of Joseph Smith, just as I had a strong love for my father. So I tend to assume similarities, but there may be important differences I don't see as well. As Pat considers the possibility that there might be other ways to see polygamy, even though she cannot as yet imagine them very well, she at least has the option of holding on to both her testimony of Joseph Smith and her desire to not tolerate deceit and lies from men she loves. She may not yet know how to reconcile these images, but as she takes into account her own possible blind spots, she can begin to explore this issue with a little less defensiveness and a little more openness to other ways of seeing. As another way to explore how our prior history affects our view of God and the church, Let's go back to questions number 1 through 6, in case you're thinking that you're off the hook here. The ones I asked you to complete before I began. I'd like you to take a moment and review your answers to those questions. They're adapted from some exercises used by marital therapy theorist Harville Hendricks. Hendricks, who is quite well known for some of his ideas, believes that each of us is inexorably attracted to a partner who will recreate with us the primary challenges of our childhood. We invest this person with the hope that this time the outcomes will be different, however. A false hope, I might add. In other words, we are specifically drawn to people with whom we are, by definition, completely incompatible. You think this is funny? You've been married 20 years. It is kind of funny, isn't it? People that we are drawn to as marriage partners are those who will help us recreate the exact puzzling, problematic issues that hurt us as children and that we are consciously determined to avoid in adulthood. But we are drawn to these people who help us recreate these problems in just enough of a different guise to fool us into thinking we have finally found someone utterly unlike our parents and who will at last meet our deepest needs. They will indeed meet our deepest needs, but only if we assume that our deepest needs are to figure out how to solve the unsolved problems of the past generations by our own courageous effort to change and learn and grow into the solutions we never could pull off as a child. And not that our deepest needs are for someone else to finally stop treating us the way our family did and thus make us feel safe and secure at last. Not laughing anymore, are we? To be sure, my spouse's repetition of my familiar and familial patterns may take a different form from what I saw at home, but it will still evoke similar feelings, beliefs, self-images, and responses in me. My spouse will also be attracted to me because I evoke familiar but troubling feelings, beliefs, self-images, and responses that plagued him. He's here today, so we'll see how this goes when I get home. And we will then both have the challenge of finding a response other than to assume it is now the other person who must change. Let me give you an example of this. Luke is a dentist. He was the youngest child in a large family in which children were no longer a novelty. His father was critical of the children, preoccupied with work, and his mother sad and almost invisible, leaving Luke anxious about his place. He learned to get attention by friendliness that bordered on intrusiveness and antics that bordered on goofiness, to which his parents responded with either mild amusement or irritation. Luke was initially attracted to Sandy because of her calm, self-effacing manner, so unlike his self-centered father. But after years of marriage, Sandy's aloof style is making him feel as invisible as he did as a child, unless he is provoking her to irritation with his inappropriate behavior. He blames her for being bored and preoccupied with her work, but the more he acts out, the more she criticizes or withdraws, making him feel yet more invisible and ignored. Luke vaguely suspects that his behavior evokes the very reactions he desires, but when he feels anxious about his place with Sandy, he really can't imagine anything to do other than provoke some response from her by his silliness. The response he wants is her attention, amusement, and engagement, but the response he gets inexplicably to him is withdrawal and criticism. I am fascinated by Hendricks' theory because it explains so much about what is otherwise inexplicable about marriage, including my own marriage, but I also think that it may help explain a few things about how we relate to God and even to the church. So let's go down to questions 12 through 17. For number 12, I have unconsciously spent my life searching for a God, a church, and religious leaders with these traits. Write in the answers you circled from number 1.